What happens when America's most trusted morning show host goes head-to-head with one of the most controversial figures in modern royalty? You won't believe what unfolds when a simple television appearance transforms into an explosive battle of wills that leaves viewers stunned and a studio in complete chaos. Last night's episode of The Today Show delivered the kind of raw, unfiltered drama that has everyone talking. And what started as a cordial conversation quickly spiraled into something nobody saw coming. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Savannah Guthrie and Meghan Markle clash in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about live television. The tension in Studio 1A was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle walked through those iconic glass doors. Sources backstage reported an unusual energy surrounding the Duchess of Sussex's appearance, with production assistants whispering about last-minute script changes and hushed phone conversations between network executives. Savannah Guthrie, known for her composed demeanor and professional approach to even the most challenging interviews, seemed unusually focused as she reviewed her notes one final time before cameras rolled. The show opened with its typical upbeat energy, but viewers with keen eyes noticed something different in Savannah's expression as she introduced her guest. We're joined now by Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, who's here to discuss her latest philanthropic endeavors and upcoming projects. Savannah announced with her trademark smile, though those familiar with her interviewing style could detect an underlying steeliness in her voice. Meghan entered the studio wearing an elegant cream-colored blazer, her signature confident stride carrying her to the guest chair. The initial pleasantries seemed normal enough. Discussions about her recent charity work, her life in California, and the various causes close to her heart. But seasoned Today Show viewers began to sense something brewing beneath the surface as Savannah's questions became increasingly pointed. "Let's talk about your relationship with the media," Savannah began, her tone remaining professional but with a noticeable shift in intensity. "You've been quite vocal about feeling misrepresented by journalists and news outlets. How do you reconcile that with your desire to maintain a public platform and continue speaking out on issues?" Meghan's response came with a slight pause, her media-trained composure flickering for just a moment. "Well, Savannah, I think there's a difference between fair reporting and what we've experienced, which has often been quite unfair and, frankly, harmful. When you're trying to do good work and support important causes, it becomes frustrating when the focus shifts to manufactured controversies rather than the substance of what you're trying to achieve." The subtle dig didn't go unnoticed by Savannah, whose years of experience had taught her to read between the lines of carefully crafted responses. Her follow-up question carried a sharper edge. "But wouldn't you say that public figures, especially those who have chosen to step into the spotlight and continue to seek media attention, have a responsibility to accept both positive and negative coverage as part of that choice?" A flash of something, annoyance, perhaps defensiveness, crossed Meghan's features before she regained her composure. "I think that's an interesting perspective, Savannah, but I would challenge the premise of your question. No one should have to accept unfair treatment or harassment simply because they're in the public eye. That's a harmful standard that we've somehow normalized in our society." The studio atmosphere grew noticeably tenser as both women maintained their professional facades while engaging in what was clearly becoming a verbal chess match. Savannah leaned forward slightly, a gesture viewers had come to recognize as her preparing for a more challenging line of questioning. "Let's address something specific then," Savannah continued, her voice maintaining its measured tone while her eyes remained locked on her guest. "There have been numerous reports from various sources about your time within the royal family, and many of these reports have painted a picture of someone who was difficult to work with. Former staff members have spoken anonymously about challenging working conditions. How do you respond to these allegations?" The question hung in the air like an electric charge. Meghan's carefully maintained composure showed its first real crack as her shoulders tensed and her smile became noticeably more forced. The pause that followed lasted just long enough to make viewers lean forward in their seats, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I find it deeply troubling, Savannah, that you would choose to amplify anonymous sources and unsubstantiated claims rather than focusing on the documented good work that Harry and I have done," Meghan replied, her voice carrying a new edge that hadn't been present moments before. "This is exactly the kind of journalism that I was referring to earlier, the willingness to prioritize sensationalism over truth." Savannah's expression remained steady, but viewers could see the journalist in her responding to what was clearly an attempt to deflect and redirect. "With respect, these aren't unsubstantiated claims. Multiple credible news organizations have reported on these issues, and they've done so following journalistic standards and practices. Are you suggesting that all of these reports are simply fabricated?" The gloves were clearly coming off now, and the tension in the studio was becoming impossible to ignore. Camera operators continued their work, but their movements seemed more cautious, as if they too could feel the electricity building between the two women. Meghan shifted in her chair, her body language becoming more defensive as she prepared her response. "What I'm suggesting, Savannah, is that there's been a clear pattern of negative coverage that goes beyond normal scrutiny. When you have multiple news outlets repeating the same narratives without independent verification, that's not journalism. That's gossip masquerading as news." Meghan's voice had grown firmer, and the diplomatic tone she'd maintained throughout the early part of the interview was rapidly disappearing. The accusation struck directly at Savannah's professional integrity, something that anyone who knew the veteran journalist understood was not territory to venture into lightly. Her response came with a sharpness that viewers had rarely heard from the typically measured host. "I have to stop you there, Meghan. The Today Show and NBC News have built their reputation on decades of credible journalism. We don't traffic in gossip, and we certainly don't report stories without proper vetting and verification. If you have specific complaints about our reporting, or the reporting of other credible news organizations, I'd encourage you to address those through proper channels, rather than making blanket accusations about journalistic integrity." The rebuke was delivered with professional courtesy, but its impact was unmistakable. Meghan's eyes flashed with something that looked very much like anger, and for the first time since the interview began, her carefully constructed public persona seemed to be slipping away entirely. The foundation had been laid for what would become an unprecedented confrontation, and viewers across America could sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold in real time. What happened next would transform this already tense exchange into something that would dominate headlines and social media discussions for days to come, as two strong-willed women prepared to engage in a battle that would expose the raw realities of celebrity, journalism, and the complex relationship between public figures and the media that covers them. The moment of reckoning arrived when Savannah made the decision that would ignite the powder keg that had been building throughout their exchange. Leaning back in her chair with the confidence of someone who had navigated countless difficult interviews, she delivered the question that would shatter any remaining pretense of civility. "Since we're discussing media coverage and accuracy, let's address the elephant in the room," Savannah said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had clearly decided to abandon diplomatic niceties. "Your interview with Oprah contained several claims that have since been questioned, and in some cases, contradicted by documented evidence. The timeline you provided about certain events, the characterizations of conversations that allegedly took place, how do you reconcile those inconsistencies with your criticism of media accuracy?" The question landed like a thunderbolt in the studio. Meghan's face went through a visible transformation, her carefully maintained composure cracking completely as her eyes widened with what could only be described as shock and indignation. The calculated, media-trained responses that had characterized the early part of the interview were instantly replaced by something far more raw and authentic. "Excuse me?" Meghan's voice rose significantly, the diplomatic tone she'd struggled to maintain finally abandoning her entirely. "Are you seriously sitting here, on national television, calling me a liar? Are you actually suggesting that I fabricated my own experiences and the pain that my family and I endured?" The accusation hung in the air like a live wire, and viewers could practically feel the electricity crackling through their television screens. Savannah, rather than backing down in the face of Meghan's obvious anger, doubled down with the tenacity that had made her one of television's most respected journalists. "I'm not calling you anything, Meghan. I'm asking you to address documented inconsistencies between your public statements and verifiable facts. That's what journalists do. We ask questions when things don't add up. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should consider why that is. The response was delivered with surgical precision, each word carefully chosen to maintain journalistic objectivity, while making it clear that Savannah would not be intimidated or derailed from her line of questioning. The effect on Meghan was immediate and dramatic. "This is absolutely unbelievable," Meghan said, her voice now carrying a tremor of genuine anger. "I came here in good faith to discuss important work and causes that matter, and instead, you've ambushed me with this prosecutorial line of questioning. This isn't journalism, Savannah. This is character assassination disguised as an interview." The accusation struck at the very heart of Savannah's professional identity, and viewers could see the moment when the veteran journalist decided that diplomacy was no longer an option. Her response came with a clarity and force that left no doubt about where she stood. Character assassination. Savannah's voice carried a new intensity, though she maintained her professional composure even as her words grew sharper. "Meghan, asking public figures to account for their public statements isn't character assassination, it's accountability. You've made serious allegations about individuals and institutions, allegations that have had real-world consequences for real people. Those people deserve to have those allegations examined and questioned." The exchange had now moved far beyond the typical boundaries of a morning show interview, entering territory that felt more like a courtroom cross-examination. Meghan's response revealed just how deeply the questions had struck. Real-world consequences? Meghan's voice rose to a level that made it clear she was no longer concerned about maintaining her public image. "Let's talk about real-world consequences, Savannah. Let's talk about the impact of relentless negative coverage on mental health. Let's talk about the harassment and threats that come from media narratives that paint people as villains. You want to talk about accountability? How about the media being accountable for the harm they cause?" The deflection was obvious, but it came with such passionate intensity that it revealed the depth of Meghan's frustration and anger. Savannah, however, was not about to allow the conversation to be redirected away from the specific questions she had raised. "We can certainly discuss media responsibility, and that's an important conversation," Savannah replied, her tone remaining steady despite the obvious tension. "But right now, we're discussing your responsibility for the accuracy of your own statements. You can't simultaneously criticize the media for inaccuracy while refusing to address questions about the accuracy of your own claims. That's not how accountability works." The logical precision of Savannah's response seemed to push Meghan over an edge she had been teetering on throughout the interview. Her next words came with a vehemence that shocked viewers and clearly caught even the experienced host off guard. "You know what, Savannah? This is exactly why people have lost faith in mainstream media. You sit there with your sanctimonious attitude, pretending to be objective while clearly having an agenda. This isn't journalism. This is a hit job, and I won't sit here and be lectured by someone who's clearly made up her mind before I even walk through that door." The personal attack represented a complete breakdown of the professional boundaries that typically govern television interviews. Savannah's response came with a steel that viewers had rarely seen from the typically diplomatic host. "My agenda, Meghan, is the truth. My job is to ask difficult questions. And if you find those questions uncomfortable, that's not a reflection of bias. That's a reflection of the fact that some questions need to be asked. You came on this show voluntarily, knowing full well that we would discuss your public statements and actions. If you expected softball questions and uncritical acceptance of everything you've said, you came to the wrong place." The confrontation had now reached a point where both women had abandoned any pretense of maintaining their public personas. The raw authenticity of the exchange was unlike anything viewers had seen on morning television, and the tension in the studio was becoming almost unbearable to watch. Meghan's response came with a fury that made it clear she had reached her breaking point. "Softball questions? I expected basic human decency and professional respect, neither of which you've shown today. Instead, you've chosen to use your platform to perpetuate the same harmful narratives that have been used to attack me and my family for years." The accusation represented a direct challenge to everything Savannah stood for as a journalist, and her response would set the stage for the final, explosive confrontation that would end with one of the most dramatic exits in television history. What happened next would be replayed countless times across social media and news outlets, as Savannah Guthrie delivered a response that was both devastating in its precision and unwavering in its commitment to journalistic principles. Her voice carried the weight of decades of experience as she looked directly into Meghan's eyes and spoke with a clarity that cut through all the diplomatic pretense that had preceded this moment. "Meghan, I'm going to say this once, and I need you to hear it clearly," Savannah began, her tone carrying an authority that commanded attention throughout the studio. "I have spent over 2 decades building my reputation on asking tough questions to presidents, world leaders, celebrities, and public figures of every stripe. I have never, not once, allowed someone to sit in that chair and dictate the terms of their coverage or demand that I abandon my journalistic responsibilities because they find accountability uncomfortable." The force of Savannah's response seemed to momentarily stun Meghan, but it also appeared to unleash something that had been building throughout the entire interview. Her face flushed with anger as she leaned forward in her chair, her voice rising to a level that made everyone in the studio acutely aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Your journalistic responsibilities?" Meghan's voice cracked with emotion and fury. "Is it your journalistic responsibility to ambush guests? Is it your responsibility to perpetuate the same toxic narratives that have been used to tear down women, particularly women of color, who dare to speak their truth? Because that's exactly what you're doing right now, Savannah, and everyone watching can see it." The accusation of racial bias landed like a bombshell in the studio, introducing an element that transformed the already intense confrontation into something far more explosive. Savannah's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying a steel that viewers had never heard before. "Don't you dare," Savannah said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "Don't you dare try to weaponize race to deflect from legitimate questions about your public statements. That is beneath you, and it's insulting to every person who has faced real discrimination. My questions would be exactly the same regardless of who was sitting in that chair, and you know it." The rebuke was so forceful and direct that it seemed to physically impact Meghan, who sat back in her chair as if she'd been struck. But rather than retreating, the confrontation appeared to push her past any remaining boundaries of television decorum. "You want to talk about what's beneath me?" Meghan's voice rose to a near shout, her composure completely shattered. "What's beneath me is sitting here being lectured by someone who clearly has no interest in fair coverage. What's beneath me is participating in this charade you're calling journalism, when it's nothing more than a character assassination disguised as an interview." The personal attacks were now flowing freely, and Savannah's response revealed just how deeply the accusations had struck at her professional core. Her voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable edge that let everyone know she had reached her own breaking point. "Character assassination?" Savannah's voice carried a dangerous quiet that somehow felt more intense than shouting. "Meghan, character assassination is making false allegations about people who can't defend themselves. Character assassination is going on international television and making claims that you know will damage reputations and relationships without caring about the consequences. What I'm doing is asking you to be accountable for those actions, and if you can't handle that level of scrutiny, then perhaps you shouldn't be seeking public platforms to make public statements." The response hit its target with devastating accuracy, and Meghan's reaction was immediate and explosive. She stood up from her chair so abruptly that it made the camera operators scramble to adjust their shots, her face contorted with a rage that was impossible to disguise. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this," Meghan declared, her voice echoing through the studio with a fury that seemed to surprise even her. "I came here in good faith to discuss important work, and instead I've been subjected to an interrogation designed to humiliate and discredit me. This is exactly the kind of toxic behavior that drove me and my family away from public life in the first place." Savannah remained seated, her composure intact even as the situation spiraled completely out of control. Her response came with the calm authority of someone who had maintained control throughout the entire confrontation. "You're absolutely free to leave anytime you choose, Meghan. But before you do, I want to make something crystal clear to you and to everyone watching. This show has always been, and will always be, a place where difficult questions get asked and public figures are held accountable for their statements and actions. That's not harassment, that's not bias, and that's not character assassination. That's journalism, and I won't apologize for doing my job." The finality in Savannah's voice seemed to be the last straw for Meghan, who began removing her microphone with shaking hands, while her anger reached its absolute peak. Her final words to Savannah were delivered with a venom that shocked everyone present. "You know what, Savannah? This conversation says far more about you and your priorities than it does about me. History will judge who was on the right side of truth, and I'm confident that when it does, you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of that judgment." With that declaration, Meghan Markle stormed toward the studio exit, her heels clicking loudly against the floor as she moved with obvious fury toward the door. But Savannah wasn't finished, and her final response would become the moment that defined the entire explosive encounter. "Meghan," Savannah called out, her voice carrying across the studio with unmistakable authority. "Truth isn't determined by who speaks loudest or who walks away first. Truth is determined by facts, evidence, and accountability. Those things don't change based on your comfort level with them." Meghan paused at the studio door, her hand on the handle, and for a moment it seemed as though she might turn around for one final exchange. Instead, she yanked the door open with such force that it slammed against the wall and disappeared from view, leaving behind a studio filled with stunned silence and a television audience that had just witnessed one of the most explosive confrontations in morning television history. Savannah remained in her chair, her composure intact as she looked directly into the camera and addressed the viewers who had just witnessed the unprecedented scene. Her voice carried the same professional authority that had characterized her throughout the confrontation, even as the magnitude of what had just occurred settled over the studio. "We'll be right back after this break," she said, her tone steady and controlled despite everything that had just transpired. The cameras stopped rolling, but the impact of what had just unfolded would reverberate far beyond the confines of Studio 1A, creating a moment of television history that would be analyzed, debated, and remembered for years to come.